Wir kommen ins Machen. Wir freuen uns auf unsere erste Keynote. In den Fokus nimmt diese die allerfrüheste Phase der Lebensjahre. Was brauchen Kleinkinder, damit sich Selbstregulation überhaupt entwickeln kann, ist hier die Frage. Und welche Rolle spielen dabei etwa Armut, Stress und auch pädagogische Beziehungen?
Sie ist Gerald S. Lesser Professorin für Kindesentwicklung und Bildung an der Harvard Graduate School of Education und sie forscht seit vielen Jahren dazu, wie sich Armut und Gewalterfahrungen auf die soziale, emotionale und Verhaltensentwicklung von Kindern auswirken und wie gut gemachte sozial-emotionale Lernprogramme im Vorschul- und Grundschulbereich diese Kinder stärken können. Ihr Vortrag trägt den Titel Self-Regulation, a Foundational Skill of the Early Childhood Period. Und es ist eine große Ehre, Sie heute hier mit einer Keynote begrüßen zu dürfen. Such an honor to have you here. A big applause, großen Applaus für Professor Dr. Stephanie M. Jones.
Welcome.
Stage is yours.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Can you understand me? Because I'm going to speak in English. It's great to be here. I'm just honored by the invitation. I am thrilled by the topic, and I'm a little intimidated by the group. And as I was planning this, I, of course, because I love this topic and I've spent my entire career working on it, I put together too many slides, which many of you are right now thinking, that's a failure of self-regulation. So I apologize. But my plan is to do a whole variety of things and to do it in about 35 minutes, at which point I will just stop talking. That will show you that I can regulate myself. And we'll have some time for questions. So my plan for about 35 minutes, and I should probably keep track, is to do too many things. The first is to reflect a little bit on today's landscape. And I'm going to do that by talking largely about how teachers are seeing and understanding what's happening with kids in the US, but I suspect it's not that different in different places around the world. I'm going to talk about self-regulation in a kind of obsessive way. You've already heard different, slightly varying terminology to define and describe self-regulation. I'm going to do more of that, and I'm going to describe it kind of from a developmental standpoint. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about stress and its impact on growth and change and self-regulation. And then I'm going to pivot to what we can do. And so I'm going to get really practical and describe some of the work that we do in my lab, which is called the EASL Lab, on very specific practical strategies that we develop in partnership with educators. And then it'll end. And you can ask me questions. So to begin with today's landscape, just in the first session, we heard a few terms that young people today are subject to many threats, that education is in crisis, or the educational system is in crisis, and some students struggle to even achieve minimum levels in reading and math. And I'm just going to add to that, not to get everybody really depressed, but to put everything into a kind of actual context that really helps us understand the importance and the salience of this moment. So in the US, we often talk about self-regulation inside a more complex system of skills. We say social and emotional skills. And I'm going to come back to that kind of concept a bunch of times. And then sometimes we just keep it easy on ourselves and we say non-academic skills. And I'm going to make the case that non-academic skills matter a great deal in schools. I'm just going to show you a little bit of data from a couple of things from the Pew Research Center 2023 survey of teachers. Teachers have been telling us recently, but also for 20 or 30 years, that children's behavior in school is their biggest problem. And today, 2023, they define children's behavior as fair or poor. 50% of teachers do. 82% of teachers say the pandemic has had a lasting negative impact on children's behavior. And we already heard about this, about mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders. About 1 in 5 children are clinically diagnosed with a mental, emotional, or behavioral disorder. Those of you who are educators, all of us in the room, probably can imagine what challenging behavior does in the classroom. It gets teachers stressed out, right? It gets their heart rate up, and they become a little reactive. And it disrupts the learning of individual children, but also the entire system of learning. It's a real challenge for educators. Fortunately, there is a great deal of science and evidence that tells us or gives us a roadmap about what to do. And that really, in its most basic sense, is to build up children's social and emotional skills. So I'm going to start a little broadly with this big idea of social and emotional skills, and I promise I will get right to self-regulation as part of that system. But first, I just want all of you to imagine a learning setting, and I'm going to give you a bunch of examples here. I keep thinking the screen is back there. I'm going to give you a bunch of examples right here, and there's one in there that is an early childhood setting. There are learning settings that focus on elementary or primary age students or middle school and high school students, and even a learning setting for adults. And each of those pictures that you can see on the screen depicts a specific learning activity, something that happens in school that is a demand, a specific activity where you learn something. So the early childhood picture depicts an educator who is reading a book with young children. This is a standard and very typical literacy or language activity for young children. We have an educator who is working with some young people in a science thing where they are dissecting a frog and learning about the anatomy of the frog. There is a picture of students who are in maybe a math class. There was a math teacher here. And they're maybe looking up at the board and they're learning an algorithm and they're trying to connect it to something that they see in the book. There's another one where some students are working together in a team to do a science experiment. They're reading something, they're taking steps, they're collaborating. And then in the middle, there's a group of educators who are together in a kind of professional learning experience. And all of you are right now in a situation of learning. You're having to listen to me talk, and many of you are listening to me talk in a different language and doing all of that translational work, and you're trying to get what I'm putting in all these complicated slides. Every single one of those learning activities, if you put your mind inside of it and imagine, what does it take to be successful for those children, for those youth, for those adults in that situation? What is demanded of them to be successful in that academic task? It's some very basic things. They need to focus their thinking, to put their attention on the educator, on the book, on the beaker, whatever it is, and then shift it around, right? From one thing to the next, something else is going to happen and attention will need to be shifted. They need to be able to manage their behavior. So it's not going to work to get the story from that educator and connect the words to the words on the page if you're going like this and pushing your neighbors. You need to be able to manage your behavior so that you can access the learning environment. You need to have positive relationships to feel that you belong in that setting, that you are noticed for who you are, that you trust the adult who's in the room, that there is a kind of sense of trust and respect and welcome in that place so that you are not distracted from what's happening in the room, the learning that's happening, because you feel uncertain, right? And then, of course, there's feelings and emotions that are all through everything. So learning itself, the kinds of things that happen to young people in schools, is fundamentally social and emotional. They're not separate things. They are deeply and closely tied together. So that's my first big point. Of course, I'm a scientist and I need to have a framework for basically everything I do. I have many frameworks. I'm going to just show you a general framework for social and emotional skills, and then we're going to pivot to self-regulation. This is one. There are so many out there. And this framework for social and emotional skills highlights key emotional competencies and skills. It highlights interpersonal skills or social competencies, and it highlights cognitive regulation and executive functions. There are other frameworks, and they include beliefs about oneself and the world. That's where some of that mindset stuff we heard about before fits in. This is just one illustration of how those skills play out. And in the cognitive domain, we have things like managing and modulating attention, inhibition, working memory. We heard about monitoring already, setting goals, planning and organizing, transitioning. In the emotion domain, we have things like expressing and identifying emotions, regulating emotions, regulating behavior and empathy. And then in the social domain, we have things like understanding and reading nonverbal social cues, resolving conflicts, cooperating, pro-social behavior, perspective taking, all of those things. So just think about all of those different things. At their core, they require a form of regulation, right? So at the core of this model, what sits underneath it and drives and supports all of those skills in that cognitive, that emotion, that social domain is a foundational form of regulation, which is what I'm going to turn to now. So we heard today already self-regulation, self-regulated learning, self-regulatory competencies. We've heard a lot of ways that it has been described, and I'm just about to make it even more complex, which is going to tax your self-regulation. So monitor yourself to see how it's going. I'm going to talk about what the specific skills are. I'm going to talk about their developmental progression. I'm going to talk a little bit about what shapes their growth and change. So what does regulation really mean? The definition that we use in my lab, that many use, that I feel like is broad and comprehensive, includes the management and modulation of thoughts, feelings, attention, behavior, and interactions in service of goal-directed activities. Sometimes when we hear management, we default to a kind of tamp down kind of thinking, when in fact what management really refers to is both tamping down and regaining control, but also amping up, right? So I just traveled all over the world to get here. I'm extremely tired. There are moments when I need to amp up my energy, right? So it goes in both directions. And in our work, we've tried to define this even more precisely. The things that we do in my lab include lots of research, practice, partnerships. And those partnerships demand that we think about the specific skills that are relevant to different age periods so that with partners, we can devise strategies that target those specific skills. So we make a lot of models to try and define very specifically what the skills are. And I'm going to show you a few of those right now. Because if we really want to make a difference in supporting self-regulation, we have to be very clear about what the specific skills are and what we're going to do to support them. So in 2019, a colleague of mine and I published a paper called An Integrated Model of Regulation for Applied Settings. And our purpose was to do some of this defining of self-regulation so that we could get to application. And our model looks like this. It really decomposes key elements from each other. So it distinguishes executive functions, which are located or operated or guided by the prefrontal cortex, from really applied regulatory behavior in context. And so it starts with executive function here, a foundation of core brain capacities and processes that support regulation skills across multiple domains and contexts. And then we have each of these regulatory domains, which has specific knowledge, skills, and experiences and opportunities to practice that support regulation in that domain. And then, over time, with development, you end up with something that's integrated, that these domains are supported by executive function and they are working together in concert to drive more sort of systemic, system-based regulated behavior. So in each of these three areas, again, I'm going back to this cognitive, emotion, and social. In the cognitive domain, we refer to skills and strategies to regulate internal thinking processes and mental actions, and this is about the dynamic between thinking and attention and basic arousal. In the emotions domain, we are referring to skills and strategies to regulate feelings and the expression of feelings in behaviorally appropriate ways. And this is really about the dynamic between managing internal feeling states and those outward behavioral responses. And then in the social domain, we're talking about skills and strategies to regulate social interactions. And this is really about managing the dynamic between your own thinking and your own feeling and how you're acting, like what's happening inside you, and the thinking, the feeling, the acting of others, right? It's really deeply inside of interactions. So that's the starting point. That's the model that we use to guide some of our practical applied work. I'm a developmental psychologist by training. I can't go anywhere without talking about human development, which is what I'm going to do now. And when we think about a developmental model of regulation, again, what we're trying to figure out is what do we need to support when? It's not the case that every single regulatory skill in each of those domains is salient at all of the time points across development. Things emerge at specific points and they grow and they change over time. And what that tells me is that we need strategies and practices that are really effective, that are targeted to different developmental points. And so here's a sense of how that works. So the developmental model of regulation that builds on that integrated model I just talked about is really about the emergence of skills, their differentiation over time, and then their integration into a system. And that operates kind of in a cycle. And the way this looks in our read of the literature and based on our research is that in early childhood, you really have the ages like 2, 3, 4, basic regulatory processes and skills emerge as executive function, which is driven by the prefrontal cortex, as I said, as that EF structure is established. And those executive functions include things like working memory, which supports monitoring, attention control, attention shifting, response inhibition, which is sort of a technical term for a version of self-control. Those foundational skills then support regulation in these different domains, that cognitive, emotion, and social domain. And those regulatory skills in that early part of development into the transition to school become differentiated as they are applied to different tasks, right? Setting-based and specific tasks of different places, like the very specific and new tasks that are demanded of young children when they are in their first group-based schooling environment. Those then become integrated together, so they weave together into a system of regulatory functioning. And these regulatory skills become increasingly integrated as more complex situations require children and adults to coordinate knowledge and skills from multiple domains in order to meet the demands of a particular task, something more sophisticated, a more sophisticated task of that period. So that's a kind of developmental model. What that tells me, if I'm looking at this, is that in the early childhood period, there's an opportunity to really support those core executive functions, but also a set of kind of foundational skills in that cognitive, emotion, and social domains. Okay, so again, as a developmentalist, we love to make tables and figure out what the specific skills are, so we made a table. You probably can't read all of these specific things. I'm going to make the slides available to everyone. You can read this when you are up in the middle of the night. You need to get back to sleep. But basically, it's like a roadmap for devising strategies, right? And it's not necessarily yet a roadmap to what types of strategies work. It's a roadmap to the specific skills that one might target with strategies. And it works going down, so each of the columns refers to a particular age period and describes those basic regulatory processes that have executive function. I didn't mention it. Effortful control components, if you want to talk more about that, we have a whole paper on it. It includes those specific domains: cognitive regulation, emotion regulation, and social regulation, and it can be read across. So within domain, this is a kind of an idea about the developmental progression of skills. And what this says is really two things. The first thing is that in the early childhood period, if that's what our focus is, we don't really want to be thinking about complex perspective taking. Those children are not ready for that. The other thing that it gives us a window into is when you're working with a child who is 10 years old, let's say, and they're really struggling with perspective taking, we can use a map like this to work backwards and say, what are the component skills of perspective taking that that child might need support with? So it operates in these two ways. As I think we heard in the beginning, there's a great deal of evidence that tells us that self-regulation and related executive function are tied to all kinds of skills over time. They are supports for academic skills, things like in the early years of schooling, transitioning from one thing to the next, planning, organizing your backpack and your work, getting yourself together, focused and engaged learning, academic behaviors, work habits and mindsets. Of course, in the emotion domain, at the bottom of this list, we have more sort of simple emotion skills like emotion knowledge and expression, emotion and behavior regulation, and then more complex empathy and perspective taking. And in the social domain, things like pro-social behavior, understanding and reading nonverbal social cues, problem solving, and conflict resolution. And if we imagine, again, putting our developmental hats on, this is a progression upward. Developmental growth and change is represented going up. But also, we go from more sort of simple skills in the early childhood period, simple in quotes, to more complex integrated skills later on. I just want to nod, of course, to the adults. I've been talking about children this entire time. In adulthood, researchers, parents, educators, politicians, oh my goodness, we use or we don't use these skills all the time. We have them at our disposal. They are evident in our relationships, at work, at home, as parents. They're in every single interaction we have. If you take one thing away from this, just imagine every interaction you have, there's a regulatory process happening. It's not a choice. It's a choice not to support them intentionally, explicitly, and systematically. But it's not a choice that they're there or not there. So when we put our heads into an educational system, it's not a choice to focus on self-regulation. It's there. Sorry, self-regulation is there. It is a choice to support it or not. Okay, and there's tons of papers, just tons and tons of papers that document quite clearly, and then there's individual studies and then meta-analyses, which are studies of studies, that show us that regulation measured in childhood in a whole variety of ways is linked to outcomes across domains over very long periods of time. Those are social emotional outcomes, mental health and well-being, health outcomes, academic outcomes, and so on. Two, I think, close to final points about this. Developmental timing is quite important. This is a heuristic from the Center on the Developing Child that gives us a general sense of when we see dramatic expansions in certain brain regions that are very, very closely tied to executive function and self-regulation. And the first is in early childhood. It is the most dramatic expansion of the prefrontal cortex. And what this tells us is that this is an opportunity not to be missed. It's not that it's all over after early childhood, but there's a real opportunity to focus on and support these skills directly during that developmental period. There is a second expansion, it's less dramatic, and that happens in sort of adolescence and the transition to adulthood. So for those of you who get tired of all the models, I just want to give you a sense of how we see self-regulation play out in practical terms. And this is something that I put together many, many years ago when my 19-year-old son was 5. And I was writing these papers about self-regulation, and I was experiencing it directly in my own personal life, and it was very illuminating. In fact, he's 19, and some of these things are still happening. So it's a lifelong endeavor. So just imagine what it takes for a young child to leave the house in the morning, and you can imagine this is a similar set of experiences in the transition to the classroom in the morning, for example. A child who is about 5 needs to put their socks on before their shoes, right? That's a working memory thing, which is that you need to remember that the socks go on first, not the shoes. This happened in my house. You have to be able to put something down and leave it, right? My son was obsessed with baseball cards, and he could not put them down, but he had to put them down. He had to leave them. They could not go to school. That was a shift your attention from one thing to the next, and a response inhibition task. He needed to be able to organize himself to get all those things that he needed at school into that backpack, his lunch, his snack, his homework, into the backpack, and he needed to inhibit enough to not eat the snack right then, because he had to think, I need that snack, I'm gonna be hungry later. He had to tie his shoes, which is, for those of you who have young children who are learning to tie their shoes, this is one of the most taxing regulatory challenge I think you can imagine. And all of that is happening while an adult is going, hurry up, we're late, it's a crisis, right? There's a big emotional press happening on that little brain while it's trying to do these complicated things. Imagine that adult in the same situation. They have a whole host of regulatory tasks themselves, right? They have to plan what's going to happen in this house when we arrive back here, right? Are the things going to be set up that I need? I have to remember all the things that I need to take with me, the car keys, the house keys, all of the things. And I have to monitor and manage that child, that 5-year-old, doing all of those other things. And most importantly, during that time, I need to keep myself together, right? I can't get mad, because that's going to delay and disrupt the regulatory skills of the child who's doing a bunch of complex things. So it's real. It's very real in these everyday moments. It's extremely real in those everyday experiences in classrooms. And so now, with time pressure and press on your mind, I'm going to quickly turn to something about stress and its role in influencing self-regulation and executive function. I am not a neuroscientist. Maybe there are some here, so forgive my very rudimentary description of what is a very complex set of processes. But basically, what happens when we're really stressed, when the lion runs into this room, right? The brain turns off that sort of planful, slow part, and it activates the quick thinking, hyper-responsive part that is not actually slowing down and thinking. It activates this flight or fight response. And that can happen in, really extreme moments, like if a lion ran into this room, which seems insane, but if it did, we'd want that fight or flight response. We wouldn't want to turn to each other and say, what's the best strategy in this moment, in this room with the lion? So this is an adaptive response. In those moments, it turns off, as I said, that sort of slow thinking, deliberative, intentional, careful part. What happens to young people and to adults with chronic exposure to stress is that reactive part is turned on over and over and over again. And it can start to take over and turn on in moments when it's not actually needed. So when a door is slammed, or when an adult asks you a question you don't have the answer to. It can result in some of this kind of stress-based fight or flight response, like a freezing or acting out. And this just isn't adaptive, right? This doesn't work in the settings where children learn and play, and it results in a pattern that goes something like this. Children and adults who are exposed to chronic and toxic levels of stress are at higher risk for difficulties in this domain specifically. And before I go on, I'm just going to give you an illustration of this from a study we recently finished, and a paper that's coming out tomorrow. And this is from the early learning study at Harvard, which is just a straight up longitudinal population-based study with a very large sample drawn from the state of Massachusetts. And we started with children when children were ages 3 and 4, and we followed them every year, sometimes multiple times a year, until they were ages 9 and 10, actually 10 and 11. And we did all sorts of measures with them. We had teacher and parent reports, we did direct assessments, we did observations, everything we could think of to capture their functioning across domains. So that was the design of this very large study. And as it turns out, if you were looking closely at that timeline, everybody knows this, the pandemic came, and in the state of Massachusetts, everything shut down everywhere across the state on one day in March of 2020. And we had been collecting our data, and we had gotten through on, I don't know what side of the screen, but the blue part that circles ages 3, 4, 5, and 3 and 4, 4 and 5, and 5 and 6, we gotten through all of our assessments for about half of our sample by the time of the shutdown, and then very quickly, just under a year later, we were able to start our assessments again with those families. And so we have data collected on children's executive function, which now you know is a core part of self-regulation, for 3 waves before the pandemic and for 2 waves after the pandemic onset. So this is really very basic study, not simple, but very basic, trying to see what happened with children's executive function, self-regulation, in consequence of the exposure to the pandemic and all of the things that were happening with families during that time. And so here's basically what we found. Here we have the point in the red, the point of the shutdown. Here we have the distribution of all of the scores in the whole sample. And here is the kind of the national norms for the MEFS, which is the Minnesota Executive Function Scale. So we have the average in the middle, and then we have 1 standard deviation above and below that. And before the pandemic, the line looked just the way we would expect it in the state of Massachusetts, which in the United States is a relatively high income state. Income tracks closely with executive function because low income comes along with all of that stress and strain I was just talking about. So we have a trajectory that we would expect, right? It tracks the national norms, it's a little bit above, if anything, which we think is basically because of income. After the pandemic, after those statewide shutdowns, children's executive function drops dramatically, almost half a standard deviation, which to those who worry about these things is dramatic and terrifying, right? If we think about how important executive function and self-regulation are to how well children do now and into the future, this is very worrisome. And so I'm going to just put that into a little bit of context. I love all of these graphs. I apologize if they're all too complicated, but this is an heuristic that basically posits a way for us to understand pandemic impacts. And each of those bars represents 20 years of development. Basically what it says is that we can really only understand the impact of the pandemic because it was population-wide, worldwide. If we understand the age of the children at its onset, so what were their developmental tasks at that moment, the history of their experience up until that point, what were the kinds of things that had already happened to them or not, and those pieces of information can give us a sense of a pathway out of the pandemic. And our sample, in the data that I just showed you, were 5, 6, and 7, at the point of those shutdowns. They were starting school, or in some cases, just halfway through their very first year of school, right? That's the moment, as I said before, when these skills are hyper-salient and those moments of social interaction and support in school and high-quality relationships really inform them. And in my head, what we're seeing, the teachers are reporting about how kids are doing in school later, now that many of them are in middle school, is a consequence of that pattern of executive function that we saw when they were entering school. So this is a bit of an alarm bell for all of us and a wake-up call to say, like, we really need to focus on and support the development of these skills in young children, but also in children who are older. Okay, now the final part, which is to pivot completely to what works in classrooms. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the type of support and program where we find most of the work on self-regulation and executive function in classrooms, and then I'm going to focus on one particular strategy that we've worked on a lot in my group. So generally, at the highest level, looking across all of the programs, the strategies, the kinds of things that we have available to us and that have been tested, looking across those, what generally works in classrooms? Like, what are the things that we need to do in classrooms to support self-regulation? The first is ensure that there are high-quality, developmentally rooted, meaning appropriate to age and stage and setting of development, high-quality developmental relationships that are happening, that are playing out in safe and caring learning settings. And a high-quality developmental relationship is responsive, it is consistent and predictable, it is supportive, it is warm. So that's number one. Number two is teaching, right? Instruction in self-regulation and executive function skills, and we could even add social and emotional skills that are related to those. And lots of opportunities to practice. The most effective version of that instruction is that adults are modeling the skills they hope to see in the children they're teaching. They're exposing them to the skills in their own behavior. They're teaching something directly. There is a lesson about attention. What does attention mean? What does it look like when you are showing me that you have your attention on me? What's shifting? What does that actually mean? There's lots of opportunities to practice, and there is a language of the skill, of the particular focus in the setting. People are talking about it. These are, of course, related to each other. It's not enough to have a really safe, caring learning setting if children are not being given opportunities to learn and practice the skills directly. And it is also not enough to just teach them if the setting itself is experienced as unsafe or that the child feels they are not welcome there. That is distracting to them. So characteristics of the approaches that embody these two big domains, they are short and targeted. They offer lots of opportunities to practice, which means children need to practice skills. They will not be able to do them right away, and so practice really helps. I think we heard about that in the introduction. They're progressively more difficult and demanding. They happen in a supportive, encouraging environment with predictable routines. Routines are a secret sauce for supporting self-regulation and executive function. They're embedded in social interactions. They happen in relationships, in live interactions. I'm covertly saying that executive function and self-regulation training on a computer is not going to be effective. Some people don't like it when I say that. Role models, educators, parents, other adults, mentors, and coaches are a support. So what does this work then typically look like in the United States and in many places around the world? A focus on self-regulation and executive function is embedded typically in curricula that are intended to support social and emotional skills more generally. That's where we find them. And the challenge with these kinds of curricula is that they are not direct, meaning they're not often directly about those specific skills. They're curricular, so schools are always facing the question, do we have time and space to fit this in? And they're complicated, meaning they follow a complex sequence. They have to start in a certain place and progress through the year, and they can be costly. The reality, outside of most of the individual field experiments where these programs have been tested, is that they are not in the real world, as my children say, implemented in the way they were tested. So they don't get implemented in a way that you would expect so that we could see the outcomes we might have seen in a study. So our approach in the EASL lab is to do something different, and it's basically to say those programs are great if you can do them, right? If you can mount them and do them in a high-quality way, fantastic. Most places are not able to do that because they don't have the resources, time, cost, and so on, and because they're looking for something that is more flexible, right? That can be implemented in ways that are adaptive to their setting, to their needs, the needs that educators say that they have. And this is where we work. So we've been thinking about how can we pull from those effective programs the strategies that are common to them and pull them out and redesign them as standalone, simple strategies that can be integrated into any educational or learning setting. Out of school time, early childhood, elementary or primary, or even at home. And so the big question for us is, if we looked really closely at all of these programs and like literally read every single activity in every unit, sorry, how does it go? Every activity in every lesson, in every unit, in every grade, could we find this kind of common denominator strategies and extract them? And what I mean here is like this. Every single evidence-based program, having now done this exercise with 50 to 60 of them, every single one has a routine in it, a simple routine that is designed to support physiological and behavioral regulation. In the second step program, it's called, that's the PATHS program, it's called Do the Turtle. In the secure program, they're called Stop and Stay Cool steps. In second step, it's this how to calm down thing. And in Mind Up, it's kind of a mindfulness exercise. When you take those, when you look at those activities and you pull them out, they're all the same, actually. They look different, but they have the same sequence of steps. And so our idea is like, why not just do that, right? Create a strategy that can be handed over to educators, or they can actually ideally participate in the creation of with you, and then hand it over to them to integrate, to do when they see the opportunity and when they need it. And that's what this sort of social emotional learning kernels are called. And over the evolution of this idea, we actually began with a set called brain games. They were focused explicitly on executive function, and then we elaborated the set to cover more of those kind of cognitive, emotion, social, regulatory domains. I'm looking at the clock. Okay. This is a low-cost targeted approach. They're very short, they're easy to use, they're flexible, they're designed to be adaptable in setting. They incorporate hallmarks of high-quality teaching in this domain, which is that it is explicit. There's teaching, modeling, practicing, discussing, and they're adaptable to different contexts, ages, and student needs. And we've done this all over the world in part with partners from many different types of educational settings and in many places, and we do it through a kind of partnership approach with rapid cycle prototyping and contextualization. Happy to talk about that later. And we're doing lots of studies of them. Just to pivot back to those brain games, they are the most closely aligned with the conversation we're having today, although I think all of them are. It's basically 31 games designed to build children's executive function skills, or we call them brain powers, which include focus, which is that sort of focused attention, attention shifting, remember, which is working memory, stop and think, which is inhibition. And the hallmark of these is that they adhere to those characteristics of effective approaches. They are short. They are fun. There's lots of opportunities to practice and play the game lots of different times, and in a kind of covert way, they demand adults and children play together, right? They create that kind of supportive, connective, relationship-oriented experience that we know is important for these skills. And they look like this. They're on fun, well-designed cards. You can just pull it out and play the game. This is one from the focus category called I Spy. Many of them are very basic play yard games that we all know from our own childhood. What makes them different in this case is that the components of the game demand that the adult make the skill explicit. That's one thing. Play the game. Doesn't matter if kids can do it or not. You just play it. And then have a debrief and a reflection afterwards on how it went. What happened when we were trying to see that thing in the room? Or what happened when I was trying to control myself even though I wanted to jump up and down? What was it like? What did it feel like in your body and in your mind? Here's one that is focused on working memory, remember power, and then another on stop and think. You can look these up. The 31 are free and available online. I can give you the URL. And in our partnerships, we've done this kind of localizing process to adapt them so they fit and suit different settings. So this is where those key partnerships come in. So the same brain game, it's really the same at its core. Make the skill explicit, practice and play, debrief, but it looks very different in all these different settings because the settings are different. They talk about the skills in a different way. The opportunities and the needs and the desires on the part of educators are different. So we've done a number of studies of these. This is from a paper in 2021, randomized design, very small. So those of you who are methodological methodologically focused will say, 6 schools, that's too few. It's okay. It means that the 6 schools means we might not find something that's actually there, but if you do find something, it's okay. So, and we see effects of brain games on direct assessments of global EF, on assessor reports of children's attention and impulsivity, doing the assessments, and then teacher reports of children's regulated behavior. If we broaden out beyond just executive function and those kind of closely allied regulated behaviors, there's a whole host of SEL kernels that target skills in those other domains. And one, for example, is called a feeling circle. This is the kind of strategy you can do with 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 56-year-olds. It's a chance for everyone to just come together and share how they feel at that moment. It's very simple, but it builds emotions vocabulary, and in the process of saying, I'm going to look inward, try and get a sense of how I'm feeling, and then I'm going to share it with you, I'm building my emotion awareness, right? And I'm giving myself the tool of being able to say, gosh, right now, I feel really angry or delighted and thrilled to be here, right? So it builds that skill that is so closely tied to emotion regulation. Another in the social domain, just by way of example, is something called Cool Kid, which is a strategy to support everybody in a particular learning setting to notice positive things that the child designated randomly as the cool kid is doing. One thing we've learned from children and from some educators over the years is that there are children, many, who never hear a positive word at school about themselves. That doesn't mean there aren't positive things to say about them. It's that we are not careful to notice, to slow down and see and then share. The cool kid is probably one of the most effective kernels that we have. And then we've been doing a large-scale randomized trial in out-of-school time, after-school settings in the state of Nebraska. We are just finishing our 2nd year. This is well-powered, 59 sites randomized to getting the kernels or not. And we just finished the analyses of our first-year data, and you are the first to see it. We see impacts between the 2 groups on children's attention and improved attention, reduced impulsivity, and their delay of gratification, so increased capacity to delay gratification, and on teachers' instructional practice, more high quality, socially and emotionally supportive instruction. So, with all of that, my conclusions are 3. Self-regulation and executive function, it's a foundational skill with lifelong effects. It's not simply, though, about things like self-control or self-discipline. There are a host of important regulatory skills in these domains, cognitive, social, and emotional, that work together. Approaches that work build skills in targeted and relevant ways. They're short, they're fun, they're intentional, they are progressive, and they're focused on regulatory skills in that system. So they're not just focused in one place. They are for children, they're for adults. Adults need support too, and they're about the setting. What are the routines in the setting that we can create? Some build skills directly, like brain games, and others create that kind of environment that is conducive to expansion of self-regulation and executive function. And then my final word is that the frontier of this work is to design for scale, right? To think about how do we design something that can actually be scaled. And in my head, that doesn't mean a cookie cutter kind of thing. It means simplifying and then creating something that is locally adaptive but still effective. And that's all. I did go over, so we only have a little bit, like 6 minutes for questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Professor Jones. We really want to give the audience the opportunity to ask some questions. Wir wollen Ihnen jetzt die Möglichkeit geben, ein paar Nachfragen zu stellen. Deswegen würde Anna einfach runterkommen zu Ihnen, damit wir auch die Übersetzung aktivieren können. Geben Sie am besten einfach die Hand und wir kommen.
Zudem haben Sie die Möglichkeit, an diesen, ja, wie im Parlament, angeordneten Sprechmikrofone reinzusprechen, aber ich komme Sie auch gerne besuchen. Nutzen Sie die Chance für einen Austausch. Oder direkte Nachfragen zur Keynote.
Hier rechts. Eine Frage.
Sehr gut. Möchten Sie uns kurz verraten, wer Sie sind?
Maike Abshagen, Bildungsministerium Schleswig-Holstein. I have two questions. If one of the requirements of self-control is to have the cognitive skills, does this explain why at the schools in Germany leading to minor leaving school certificates, they have more difficulties with the self-regulation of their pupils? And second, if children have high external stress, for example, in their family, does this mean that it's more complicated for them to self-regulate? And thank you very much for the really good input.
You're welcome. I feel like there's an echo. No, it's just me hearing myself weirdly. So to your second question about stress and strain in families, yes, the research would tell us that children who face in their families or in other settings chronic levels of stress that could be tied to the constellation of stressors that travel with low family income. There are many things, not just the money, it's all the things that come along with that. Those children are likely or can struggle with executive function and self-regulation because of that stress response system that I described before. That doesn't mean that it's true of everyone, right? There's variation in a population. What it tells me is that we need to think really carefully about the kinds of supports to put in place. And a universal preventive effort in schools is going to support those children and anybody else. So the most effective strategy to interrupt that stress cycle, that stress response cycle, are strategies like the ones I showed you just here. They are effective. They make a difference in mitigating the effect of stress and strain. The first question, I'm not so sure I totally heard it. Do you want to say it again?
Einen Moment, genau, das Mikro kommt.
If a pupil has minor cognitive possibilities, does this mean it's more complicated to learn self-regulation?
Right, so a child who might have learning challenges or special needs, maybe, it could be. It's not necessarily the case because learning difficulties are so wide-ranging. So I wouldn't assume that all children who struggle in one way or another with learning that they're going to have challenges in this domain, necessarily. But again, universal preventive interventions make a difference for everybody, right? For children who are just learning skills, for children who have specific challenges, for children who are facing stress and vulnerability.
Verraten Sie uns gerne, wer Sie sind.
Hi, my name is Laura. Lovely listening to you. I work on the foundation side, fostering SEL in education, and you talked about the relevance of the adult accompanying the kids. And as adults, we usually shape the structures of where kids are. So I would love for you to hear your homework for us in what do we as adults have to do to catch up with our own SEL and regulational skills and the structures we build for kids.
I mean, that is a great question, and I really underdid it on the adults in this particular presentation. Some might even hazard or hypothesize that if we spent all of our time supporting the adults, we wouldn't have to do any of this stuff with kids, that the adults would be ready to support them in the ways that they need, and development would proceed, and that would be that. So adults in the system are incredibly important, and you know, I assume many of you are parents and remember those moments when you were not exercising your self-regulation in relation to your child, and you were mad and losing control. And I admit having had those moments, and I remember them acutely, right? They felt so impactful. And so if we can support adults to manage their own emotions, to recognize when they're losing control, to have supports in place to help them with their own self-regulation, their mental and emotional well-being, that will go a very long way to supporting children. So the challenge for all of us is to think about how do we do things directly with young children and how do we support the adults who are doing that work. In our lab, that often begins with a partnership with those adults and a question: what do you need? What are the challenges you are facing in your setting? And what can we do together to address them? So I think we have to be really careful about the tendency for people like me to show up and say, like, do this. That's not an effective strategy. A partnership strategy is very effective. It takes a little more time, but it's more effective.
Ja, applaudieren. Wir haben hier vorne noch eine Frage. Sie können die auch wirklich gerne auf Deutsch stellen. Wir haben ja die Übersetzung dafür da. Bitte schön.
Thank you. Thank you for your inspiring talk. I have two questions regarding your model. And one of them is, you mention cognitive self-regulation and you mention emotional self-regulation. I was missing the motivational self-regulation as one component. And the second question is regarding the social relation or social regulation. Is it really at the same level of cognitive, emotional, and then social relation, or is it more like, on the one hand, you need the social relations in order to attain self-regulation skills, and on the other hand, it's an important domain in which you show your self-regulation. But why are they on the same level?
We could spend a lot of time messing around with the models, and we have, and the pictures I showed you are just the surface of all of the crazy pictures that we've made in the lab to try and represent the phenomenology of these complex processes. And I'm sure that our heuristics, they're really heuristics, they're sort of shortcuts for trying to get to understanding, are not perfectly accurate to some of the complexity that really exists. The cognitive, social, and emotional component of that model is a way for us to define and describe the kinds of behaviors that we see in the world children engage in, as opposed to those that might be located in the brain, right? So there's the kinds of brain processes, like technically executive function is a brain process. It gets shown to us through behavior in the world. And so when we're trying to think about strategies, we're more focused on the kinds of things that are really behavioral, that are the ways that all of this system of skills shows up in children's behavior in the settings where they learn. So I appreciate the elaboration to the model, and I'm not really addressing your question because I don't really have a good answer. So, but the idea is to get to the behavior, the stuff that is shown in the world, as opposed to the kinds of things that we might not see. Your first question, I mean, I agree. Motivation is a key part of this system, and I only described kind of a subset of what is a much more elaborated system. And I do think that when we take the kind of big developmental view, however we each define and describe based on our own read of the literature, our own specific demands and tasks in our settings, our cultural orientation, across all of those things, and in a kind of universal sense, I do think that there are these core developmental systems that help us get specific and precise about the work that we need to do. One is a regulatory system. It's a developmental system. It is true of everyone. And another is a motivation system, right? Another is a communication system. And focusing just on that regulatory system is was my focus today, but I suspect we can do something similarly complex, the motivational system and all of these others. Again, a kind of vague response to your question.
Okay. We can take this one last question here. Diese letzte Frage hier vorne, genau.
Zeiger.
Yeah, many thanks from my side too for this fascinating talk. When I saw the landscape where you distributed the program, Germany was blank. And I was wondering, given that you were able to implement the program in so many very, very different places, are there any ingredients to success? Anything that you could say it really works well in these places where the history is such and such, or the mindset of people is such and such, where the structures are set up in a certain way that may help us here?
Yeah, great question. The one key part to success in those settings is that while the look and feel and the words and the focus of the kernels and the brain games, while those things vary in some places quite significant ways across all those settings on that map, every single one in every place adheres to that core structure. And that core structure, which is that you make the skill explicit, whatever it is, you play a game or do something where that skill is explicitly practiced, and then you reflect and debrief afterwards. That is the case in every single setting. That's the kernel of the kernel. Those three things need to be in place, and that derives from our sort of assessment of all of those programs and the evidence behind them. So that makes for success. I think the second thing is this kind of partnership model. We start all of those projects asking those two questions, which is like, what's happening here? What do you need? And how do you talk about and think about this body of skills? And then we weave that information into the strategy. And a third, I'll just say a third, one place where it has been really successful, and probably the most, or two places over the years, the most systematically scaled is Ukraine and Brazil. In Ukraine, they have a kind of hangover from the prior educational system that they're in the process during a war of transforming, is a kind of centralized structure. So there's lots of buy-in in the Ministry of Education, and that filters down to a system that is really quite, even in the face of war, very functional in spreading things with regional coordinators who train master trainers, who then train educators and support them. And so there's an infrastructure for spread that is very effective. In Brazil, it's a little different, but the mechanism that they have adopted for scaling is to support nationally a course that every early educator can take for free that is about social and emotional skills and self-regulation, executive function, and then shares the specific kernels that have been created in Brazil. So those two, like having a plan and a mechanism for scaling, not all places have that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Dankeschön,
very much.
vielen Dank. Thank you very much, Ms.
Thank
Jones.
you.
Dankeschön. Große Ehre, Sie hier zu haben.